In 1927, in a cemetery in New Jersey, a group of men opened a grave that had been sealed for 5 years. The woman inside had died at 24, and the death certificate said syphilis. Her family had never believed it. So they had her exhumed, and a physicist was waiting. They took what remained of her jawbone into a dark room and laid it directly onto a sealed photographic plate wrapped in black paper in complete darkness. Then they left it there. When the plate was developed, there was an image on it. Her bones had photographed themselves. She had been dead for 5 years and she was still glowing. This is the story of the Radium Girls, of the young women who were told by men who had every reason to know better that the substance they were painting onto watch dials was not only harmless, but good for them, of what it did to them, and of what they did about it, because unlike almost every story on this channel, this one ends with the victims winning. A quick warning before we go further. This one is grim, and every word of it is true, including the part where the bodies of these women are still measurably radioactive today, a century after they were buried, and will remain so for the next 1600 years. To understand how this was allowed to happen, you have to understand that for about 30 years, radium was the most exciting substance on Earth. It was isolated at the very end of the 1890s by 2 researchers in Paris working with tons of uranium ore in a leaking shed. One of them was Marie Curie. What they found was an element that appeared to break every rule. It produced energy apparently out of nothing, continuously, without burning or being consumed. And it glowed a faint, eerie blue-green light that needed no power source and never went out. Nobody understood what that meant. Radioactivity had only just been discovered. The idea that this energy was coming from atoms tearing themselves apart, and that the same process would tear apart anything nearby, was still years away from being properly grasped. What people saw instead was a miracle. Here was a substance that produced limitless energy from inside itself. And because early experiments showed that radiation could destroy tumors, which is true and remains the basis of radiotherapy today, it acquired a reputation as a healing force. If it could kill a cancer, the reasoning went. Imagine what it might do for an ordinary tired body. The result was one of the strangest commercial manias in history. You could buy radium water, sold in ceramic jars, that added radioactivity to whatever you poured in, marketed as a general tonic. There was radium toothpaste, promising a brighter smile. Radium face cream, promising a youthful glow, and in the most literal sense delivering it. There were radium suppositories, radium chocolate, radium wool for babies' blankets, and radium-infused butter. There was even a radium-based patent medicine sold as a cure for exhaustion and low spirits, taken by the wealthy in small brown bottles. And it worked, in the short term, in the way stimulants work. People taking it reported feeling energized. That feeling was radiation damage beginning, but nobody was in a position to know that yet. It ended, eventually, in the most public way possible. A wealthy American industrialist and amateur golfer named Eben Byers drank several bottles of radium tonic a week for years, on the recommendation of his doctor, because he had hurt his arm. By the time he died in 1932, his jaw had largely disintegrated and holes had opened in his skull. A famous newspaper headline of the era summarized it with brutal economy. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. He was buried in a lead-lined coffin. When he was exhumed decades later for study, his remains were still highly radioactive, and there is one more name that belongs on that list. The one that should have been the warning. The woman who pulled radium out of that Paris shed loved the thing she had found. Marie Curie kept a vial of it beside her bed simply to watch it glow. She carried tubes of it loose in her coat pockets. She wrote with something close to wonder about the faint light that filled her laboratory in the dark. She had no idea she was describing her own death. Radium does not care who discovers it. It rots bone whether that bone belongs to a factory girl in New Jersey or to the most celebrated scientist alive. Curie's blood counts fell for years. Her fingertips cracked and would not heal. In 1934, she died of a disease of the bone marrow, the quiet factory that makes our blood, worn out by the things she had handed the world. And here is where it stops being history and starts being now. Her notebooks, the ordinary paper she wrote her measurements on more than a century ago, are still so radioactive that you cannot simply open them. They are kept in lead-lined boxes in a library in Paris, and anyone who wants to read them signs a waiver and handles them in protective gear. The pages are still hot. They will still be hot long after everyone watching this is gone. The same glow that was about to eat the dial painters was already eating the woman who found it. It is still glowing in her handwriting tonight. Hold on to that, because it is the thread running underneath everything that follows. The radium never stopped. It simply ran out of people to kill in one place and move to the next. But by then, the young women in the dial painting factories had already been dying for over a decade. And their story starts with a war. When the First World War began, armies needed instruments that could be read in the dark. Watches, compasses, aircraft gauges, gun sights. Radium, mixed with zinc sulfide, produced a paint that glowed permanently without any power. It was, for that purpose, genuinely brilliant technology. The demand was enormous and the work was delicate. Painting the tiny numerals on a wristwatch face required a very fine brush and a very steady hand, and the companies concluded that young women were best suited to it. Factories opened in Orange, New Jersey, in Waterbury, Connecticut, and in Ottawa, Illinois. They hired teenagers and women in their early 20s, many straight out of school, some as young as 14, and it was a good job. It paid several times what a woman could earn in most other factory work of the period. It was clean, indoor, respectable work. Girls competed to get hired, and sisters brought their sisters in. Families were proud. The technique they were taught was called lip pointing. To keep the brush tip fine enough for the smallest numbers, the painters were instructed to shape it with their mouths. Dip the brush in the radium paint. Draw it between the lips to bring it to a point. Paint the numeral, repeat. A fast painter might do 250 dials in a day, which meant she put a radium-loaded brush into her mouth thousands of times a week. They asked about it. Of course they did. Several of the women later testified that they had raised concerns and were told directly that the material was harmless. Some were told it would put color in their cheeks. The company chemists and executives who handled radium in the same buildings, meanwhile, used lead screens, tongs, and protective aprons. That contrast is the entire moral center of this story, and it was not an accident, and it was not ignorance. It was two different sets of rules for two different classes of people in the same building. And because the paint was harmless, because they had been told it was harmless, the young women played with it. They painted their fingernails with it for fun. They painted their teeth before going out dancing, so their smiles would glow. They painted buttons on their dresses and lines on their eyelids, and they walked home through the dark streets of small American towns shining faintly, laughing about it. In the towns where they worked, people called them the ghost girls. They glowed in their own bedrooms at night. Their hair, dusted with the powder, glowed on the pillow, and it seemed like a joke. If the buried corners of our own history keep pulling you in like this, take a second to subscribe. Digging up the grimmest true stories our species has left behind is the entire reason this channel exists. And stay with this one, because what the company did when the first women started dying is worse than anything the radium did to them. The first cases appeared around 1922, and they came through dentists. A young woman would go to her dentist with a persistent toothache. He would examine her, find a decayed tooth, and extract it, and the socket would not heal. It would remain open and infected and painful. Then another tooth would loosen, and another, and eventually the dentist, probing gently at the gum, would find that the jawbone underneath had become soft, and that pieces of it could be lifted out. In several documented cases, a woman removed part of her own jaw with her fingers. This condition was so distinctive that it acquired its own name in the dental literature, radium jaw. And it was only the beginning, because radium had done something to these women that no dentist could see. Here is the mechanism, and it explains everything that followed. Radium sits directly below calcium in the periodic table, which means the body cannot reliably tell them apart. Swallowed radium is treated by the body as though it were calcium, and calcium is what bones are built from. So the radium was carried into the skeleton and locked into the bone itself. And then it stayed. The half-life of the main isotope involved is about 1600 years, which means that on any human timescale, it never leaves. These women were not exposed to radiation and then removed from it. They had become the source. Every hour of every day, from inside their own bones, they were being irradiated at point-blank range, and there was nothing anybody could have done to stop it, even if they had understood. The jaw went first, because that is where the highest doses landed, from the lip pointing. But the radium was throughout the skeleton, It destroyed bone marrow, causing severe anemia. It produced spontaneous fractures. Women broke legs and hips while walking or stepping off a curb because the bone had simply been hollowed out. It caused tumors that grew through bone and out through the skin. Some women's spines collapsed and they lost inches of height. Some became unable to walk. Many were dead within a few years of the first symptom, in their 20s and 30s. So what did the companies do? The first thing they did was deny it. Executives stated that there was no connection between the work and the illnesses and continued hiring. The second thing they did is the part that is genuinely difficult to forgive. When the deaths could no longer be ignored, the story circulated that these women were dying of syphilis. Understand what that accusation did in 1920s America. It was not merely wrong. It destroyed the reputation of a dying woman and of her entire family. It implied that she had brought it on herself, and it made it far harder for her to be believed by anyone, doctors, neighbors, or a court. It meant a young woman spending her last months defending her own character while her bones dissolved. One of the women whose death certificate carried that diagnosis is the woman whose grave was opened in the story that began this video. Her family knew it was a lie. Proving it required digging her up. The third thing they did was manufacture Reassurance. Companies arranged medical examinations for their workers, and in documented instances, told the women the results were fine, while the findings themselves indicated otherwise. Experts were funded to produce competing conclusions. Studies critical of the industry were suppressed or pressured. The strategy was not to win the argument, it was to make the argument last longer than the women would. Because a cover-up of this kind needs a scientist. A man with letters after his name who will stand up, look at a dying woman, and tell her she is perfectly healthy. The industry found theirs. His name was Frederick Flynn, and on paper he was an industrial specialist from a respected university. He examined the women. Then he told them, and the newspapers, and eventually a court, that radium had nothing to do with their crumbling jaws. That they were fine, that there was nothing here to see. He was not, as it later emerged, a medical doctor at all. And the firm, leaning so gratefully on his conclusions, had a considerable interest in what those conclusions were. But the human body is a witness that cannot be bought, because there is another man in this story. Sabin von Sochocki was the chemist who invented the glowing paint in the first place. He had built the recipe. He had shown the painters how to bring a brush to a point, and by the time the lawsuits came, his own creation had turned on him. His hands were ruined, and he had already lost a finger to it. When his breath and his bones were measured, they registered more strongly than those of the women who were dying. He did not hide it. At the end, the man who made the paint stood on the side of the people it had poisoned and testified for them, and then died of it himself before the case he was helping could finish. And there had been an honest report all along. Years earlier, the industry had commissioned a physiologist from Harvard, Cecil Drinker, to inspect the plant in Orange. He found the building saturated with contamination, found the workers already sick, and wrote it down plainly. The report that reached the state authorities said the opposite. His findings had been quietly rewritten, and his name left attached to a conclusion he had never reached. So this is not a story about one cruel man. It is a machine, pay the expert who says the safe thing, bury the one who does not, and let the argument run longer than the witnesses can survive it. That was the strategy, and it very nearly worked, because these women had almost no legal ground to stand on. Under the law of the time, in most relevant jurisdictions, occupational illness was extraordinarily difficult to sue over. Statutes of limitations often required a claim within a short window of the exposure, but radium poisoning takes years to declare itself, so by the time a woman could prove she was ill, her right to sue had frequently already expired. The law had been written, in effect, in a shape that made this specific injury unactionable, which is why what happened next matters so much. A former dial painter named Grace Fryer decided to sue. It took her 2 years to find a lawyer willing to take the case. 2 years, while she got sicker. Eventually she found one, and 4 other women joined her, and in 1928 the case came to court in New Jersey. The newspapers of the day called them the Radium Girls, and the sight of them in that courtroom did more than any legal argument could have. Several of them could no longer raise their arms high enough to take the oath. One could not sit upright without a back brace. They were young, and visibly dying, and photographed constantly. The case was settled before it concluded. Each woman received a lump sum, an annual payment, and coverage of medical costs. It was not, by any measure, adequate compensation for a life, but it was an admission extracted from an industry that had spent years insisting there was nothing to admit, and it was extracted in public. And then, a decade later, it happened again in Ottawa, Illinois, where a different company had gone on using the same methods long after the New Jersey scandal, and where the women had been reassured with the same words. One of them was Catherine Donahue. By the time her case was heard in 1938, she weighed a little over 60 pounds and could not leave her house. The hearing was moved to her home, and she gave testimony from her own bed, with a piece of her jawbone that had come away kept in a small box as evidence. She won. The company appealed repeatedly and lost every time, right up to the Supreme Court, which declined to hear it. She died before the money reached her. That case, and the New Jersey settlement before it, changed the law. Because of these women, the principle that an employer can be held liable for a disease caused by working conditions, even when the disease appears years later, was established and strengthened in American law. Statutes of limitations for occupational illness were rewritten to run from the discovery of the disease rather than from the exposure. Industrial safety standards for radioactive materials were created where none had existed. Workers gained the right to compensation for harm that takes a decade to show itself. And there is one more consequence, which almost nobody knows, and which is the strangest legacy of all. When the United States began building nuclear weapons, it faced a question nobody could answer. How much internal radiation can a human body absorb before it kills them? There was no data. You cannot run that experiment, except that the experiment had already been run, accidentally, on hundreds of young women in 3 American towns. Researchers tracked the surviving dial painters for decades, measuring the radium still in their bodies, correlating dose against damage, following them for the rest of their lives. That data became the foundation for the internal radiation exposure limits used to protect workers in the nuclear industry, and it remains a reference point in radiation protection today. Which means that every person working safely with radioactive material in the last 70 years has been protected by numbers written in the bones of women who were told the paint was harmless. And the radium itself never left, either. When the factories closed, the poison did not go with them. That is the part almost nobody is told. The plant in Orange shut its doors, but the contaminated ground stayed. Worse, the waste was cheap, and so it was spread. Radioactive fill ended up under driveways, under lawns, under the foundations of ordinary houses in the streets around the site. Families moved in. Children played in gardens that ticked. It took until the closing decades of the 20th century for that ground to be declared a federal cleanup site and for the poison to be dug back out of it 1 truckload at a time. The same thing happened in Ottawa, Illinois. The factory was demolished, but the rubble did not stay put. Contaminated material worked its way into the town itself, into fill and foundations where people were living, and Ottawa spent decades on cleanup programs of its own. Think about what that means. The radium outlived the company that sold it. It outlived the lawsuits and the headlines and the women it killed. It soaked into American soil and simply waited. Some of those cleanups only finished within living memory. And on the timescale radium works to, finished is a generous word. It was never destroyed, it could not be. It was moved and the spot was marked. Their remains are still there too. Bodies exhumed in the 1920s, the 50s, and later decades were all found to be significantly radioactive. The radium in those graves has barely begun to decay. It will still be there, still emitting, when every person who reads about this is long forgotten. So here is what is worth sitting with. This is not a story about ignorance. That is the excuse we usually get to hand out on this channel. The physicians who bled patients believed they were helping. The flagellants believed they were saving their towns. That defense is available for almost everyone, in almost every video we have made. It is not available here. In the same buildings where the women were told to put the brushes in their mouths, the men handling the same material stood behind lead. Somebody knew. The knowledge and the ignorance were separated by 1 flight of stairs, and what finally settled it was not that anyone in charge changed their mind. It was that a group of dying women in their 20s, who had been called liars and told they had a shameful disease, refused to go quietly and dragged the whole thing into a courtroom where it could be photographed. So the question worth sitting with is this: in the buildings where you work, and in the products you were told are perfectly safe, who is currently standing behind the lead? Tell us what you think, down in the comments.